Good morning, Wabash. Our speaker today earned his BA in History and German at Wabash College in the class of 1959. From there, he went and earned his JD at the University of Akron. He's a member of the Cincinnati Bar Association, has written many articles about Lincoln the lawyer, and 4 books for lawyers. He taught at the University of Salzburg College of Law and is currently a professor of law at Northern Kentucky University Chase College of Law. Please welcome our speaker, Roger Billings.
Thank you, Kyle, for inviting me to speak to my favorite crowd of people. You notice that I graduated in 1959, and that was 50 years ago. But please, I'm not old enough to have seen Abraham Lincoln. And my one classmate in the audience, I saw Rex Henthorne. He's not old enough to have seen Abraham Lincoln either. And I'm sorry to say that Lincoln never saw Wabash College, but he was close when he traveled from Danville, Illinois to Indianapolis. And speaking of Danville, Illinois, 2 Wabash students from that town, John and William Black, were severely wounded at the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas, and they were the first brothers to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. Lincoln knew them well. And now I want to take you back to March of 1865, the Civil War, nearly at the end. General Grant thought it might be good for an exhausted President Lincoln to come down to Army headquarters at City Point, Virginia, and it would do him good to get out of Washington. He might even see the last battle of the war. About 2 weeks later, the Confederates did abandon Petersburg and Richmond, and Lincoln wanted to be among the first Yankees to enter Richmond. So on April 4, with Admiral David Porter and just 12 sailors for a bodyguard, Lincoln stepped off a barge on the James River in the city of Richmond. It was the day after Jefferson Davis fled the city. Admiral Porter records what happened next. Immediately, a group of black laborers recognized him. Their leader dropped his spade and blurted out, "Bless the Lord, there's the great Messiah, glory hallelujah." Some of the laborers fell on their knees and tried to kiss the feet of the president. Lincoln was embarrassed. He said, "Don't kneel to me, that's not right. You must kneel to God only and thank Him for the liberty you will hereafter enjoy." But the word spread, and crowds of blacks appeared, shouting, "Bless the Lord, Father Abraham's come." This is far from the attitude of some modern critics. In 1922, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "Lincoln was big enough to be inconsistent, cruel, merciful, peace-loving, a fighter, despising Negroes and letting them fight and vote, protecting slavery and freeing slaves." The heir to those sentiments is the notable African-American historian, Lerone Bennett, Jr. Mr. Bennett has elaborated on Du Bois's ideas. Bennett's thesis is that there were many abolitionists fighting for immediate freedom of slaves, and Lincoln wasn't among them. It's an affront to those abolitionists who put Lincoln on a pedestal as the great emancipator. He's given credit where credit's not due. It's time to put him in his place as a president who rode to political success on the backs of black people, who never sincerely wanted emancipation, but was pushed hard by the radical abolitionists to reluctantly issue the Emancipation Proclamation. In other words, quoting the title of Bennett's book, Lincoln was forced into glory. Our question for this morning is, should Lincoln be a whipping boy for the lingering racism in America? To get at the truth about Lincoln and slavery, let's put on the table 2 of those most seemingly prejudiced things Lincoln ever said. Let's examine them in the context of the times. Here are the words from the Charleston, Illinois, Lincoln-Douglas debates, often quoted by those who portray Lincoln as a racist. "I am not nor ever have been in favor of bringing about any equality of the white and black races. I am not nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes. nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And here are some other oft-quoted words written to the New York Tribune publisher Horace Greeley in August 22nd, 1862. He said, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that." Combine those words with the fact that Lincoln advocated that freed slaves be encouraged to settle in colonies, that he once represented a slave owner in a case to get back a runaway slave, and that he told so-called darky jokes making fun of black people, and you have Bennett's case. Of course, there are explanations. As for colonization, it turns out that even some abolitionists believed freed slaves would have better lives if they could live somewhere else than in America. They viewed colonization as a humanitarian idea. As for Lincoln representing a slave owner, he only did what was natural for a young lawyer, and that was routine for his day. They took on all kinds of clients, even unpleasant ones. Besides, Lincoln lost the case, and we suspect he had no regrets. As for the darky jokes, Lincoln made jokes about white people far more often. You might say Lincoln was an equal opportunity jokester. How then should we interpret the two serious statements from Lincoln's mouth? Bennett says it doesn't matter that Lincoln's statements were made in the heat of political battle. But it is crucial to an understanding of Lincoln's statements that he was softening up his audience. Lincoln knew that radical abolitionists advocating freeing the slaves at any cost, Lincoln knew that radical abolitionists advocated freeing slaves at any cost, but he chose a nonviolent, step-by-step approach. He was always contending with a majority of Northerners who were highly prejudiced against black people. To get anywhere, he knew he must not confront them head-on as abolitionists would. He must not appear to agree with abolitionists. But the fact that Lincoln did not agree with the approach of abolitionists, who had no practical chance of achieving their goals anytime soon, did not mean that Lincoln accepted slavery. Now let's consider the Emancipation Proclamation. In the early years of the war, Lincoln pacified the majority of Northerners by reassuring them the war was for preserving the Union, not for black freedom. In the Greeley letter of August 22nd that I read, he put preservation of the Union above the freeing of the slaves, but he was already working on the Emancipation Proclamation. A month earlier, in July, he had read a preliminary draft of the proclamation to his cabinet. True, he might have said his sole purpose in making the proclamation was to weaken the enemy and not to respond to abolitionist pressure for emancipation. He might have said that. But the military purpose coincided with his own underlying purpose. Lincoln believed that only by winning the war and preserving the Union could slavery be ended. Scholars point to the strange wording of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was dull, written in dull legal terminology. Some say it had all the grandeur of a bill of lading. It was written without passionate words of freedom. Lincoln drafted it to sound like a purely military measure. He wanted it to be that way. It had to survive court challenges of pro-slavery elements in the North. Full emancipation required a constitutional amendment. It could not be achieved by proclamation. Another peculiarity of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it covered only slave states where they were in rebellion to the North. The emancipated slaves were only from those states in rebellion. In other words, slaves trapped behind the Confederate lines. Lincoln cleverly drafted the proclamation to exclude the border slave states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, which had remained loyal to the Union. He knew that at times those states teetered on the brink of joining the Confederacy, and that if the proclamation included their slaves, they would join the Confederacy. The war in that event would be as good as over. Kentucky especially concerned Lincoln, as it leaned more and more toward the Confederacy as the war progressed. Nothing must be done to anger Kentuckians, even though they surely knew that the proclamation spelled eventual doom for slave owners. Lincoln knew that the omission of border states from the proclamation would keep them out of the Confederacy as the war continued. The proclamation was not the single event that made slaves free. It was just one more step toward freedom. Lincoln moved step by step. Sometime you must read about Lincoln's joy in 1865, when Congress passed the 13th Amendment and freed all slaves. That amendment would free all slaves when ratified. And who was lobbying hardest for the amendment? Yes, Lincoln, side by side with abolitionists. The amendment passed with just 3 votes, above the required 2/3 majority. You see, Lincoln was still confronting racism at the war's end. He was especially pleased with the amendment because now a future Congress could not repeal his Emancipation Proclamation as unconstitutional. In other words, the amendment confirmed the idea of freedom in the proclamation, which had rested on shaky ground. You might ask, why was Lincoln not an abolitionist, like Salmon P. Chase, for example, his Secretary of the Treasury? The statement Lincoln made during those debates in 1858 must be examined in the context of the social and political climate of Southern Illinois. Abolitionists in Illinois were few. They lived mostly in New England, mostly Massachusetts, where William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and of course Frederick Douglass lived. Abolitionists had some political clout, but not much. And in central Illinois, the few abolitionists there were had absolutely no political clout. In fact, the most vocal of them was an abolitionist newspaper publisher named Elijah Lovejoy, and he was killed by a mob in Alton, Illinois in 1836, when Lincoln was a young man in the legislature. The social climate in Illinois was pro-slavery because most of the population consisted of people who had moved up from the South. According to research by historian Christopher Schnell, by the 1830s, central Illinois contained a mix of settlers from both North and South. Settlers from the upland South, that's Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolinas, represented the largest group of immigrants. Kentuckians were the first large immigrant group to take up residency in Illinois, first settling in southern Illinois, and then during the 1830s farther north, colonizing the fertile soil of central Illinois. In 1850, the first year of the federal census, male native-born Kentuckians were the second largest immigrant group in Illinois, and the largest single immigrant group in central Illinois, where Lincoln lived. The majority of the population in central Illinois as late as 1850 was born in Kentucky. Native-born Kentuckians were the core population in several of the counties that formed the 8th Judicial Circuit, Lincoln's home circuit. These Kentuckians were pro-slavery. It's understandable that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. To be one in Illinois was to have no chance for statewide political office. Politicians like Lincoln wanted to prevent slavery from moving into new states, and they believed that was he believed with them that was the most they could do. The Constitution permitted slavery and even permitted fugitive slave laws. Lincoln knew the Constitution would have to be changed in order to abolish slavery, and that seemed impossible as long as the South had substantial representation in Congress. One solution would be to allow the South to become an independent nation, and for the North to pass an amendment freeing the slaves. That solution would be meaningless, since the amendment would only affect the North, where slavery no longer existed, and the South would have been independent, unaffected by the Congress. The real solution would be to preserve the Union, work against slavery from within it. That's exactly what Lincoln determined to do. In a true sense, the war was fought to make the nation ready to vote for the constitutional amendment, the 13th Amendment. It was passed in the last months of the Civil War at a time when the South had no vote, but even so, it barely passed. Although Lerone Bennett gives Lincoln little credit for its passage, most other historians do. Back in Illinois in the 1850s, Lincoln wasn't sure a civil war was necessary to rid the nation of slavery. He did not conceive of a war where more men were killed than in all other wars in our history put together. In Illinois, at that time in his life, he saw it his duty to contain slavery in the South, where there were already signs that the cotton plantations which supported slavery were petering out. For a slavery to survive, new cotton plantations in new states would be necessary, and that is what Lincoln worked to prevent. Still, if he was working so hard to contain slavery, why was it necessary to say such racially charged and negative things in the Lincoln-Douglas debates? My answer is that Lincoln was using one of his typical legal devices. Give away all your opponent wants, and then hit him with the real nub of your argument. When Lincoln made final arguments to a jury, he was famous for conceding points to the opposition. Then, just as the opposition thought Lincoln was giving his case away, he would argue the one point that was really important. He would often win the case this way. Lincoln argued like this in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He knew his audience basically understood slavery was wrong, but most of them were from the South, and they didn't want to hear that black people were their equal. And so Lincoln gave them what they wanted to hear. He conceded that black people were not his equal in all respects, but this was only to set up his main point. Here's what he said in the last debate in Alton. The real issue, he said, in this controversy, the one pressing upon every mind, is the sentiment on the part of one class that looks upon the institution of slavery as a wrong, and of another class that does not look upon it as a wrong. The sentiment that contemplates the institution of slavery in the country as a wrong is the sentiment of the Republican Party. In other words, he concluded the debates by making the morality of slavery the issue. Bennett says Lincoln knew nothing or next to nothing about black people, and he liked to mimic their language and their gait while telling darky jokes. It's true, Lincoln told darky jokes, but what Bennett omitted is that Lincoln told so many more whitey jokes, mimicking them just the same. No one was safe from Lincoln's jokes. As for the statement Lincoln knew nothing about black people, Bennett admits in his book that Lincoln's Springfield barber, William de Fleurville, was black, and that Lincoln looked out for his legal interests, pro bono. Bennett insists, however, that Billy the barber was at best a Lincoln acquaintance. He downplays the fact that Billy was invited to be a pallbearer at Lincoln's Springfield funeral. Bennett admits that Lincoln represented other black clients, but concludes there was little or no real communication in any of these relationships. I find it odd to say Lincoln had no real communication with his law clients, with his black law clients. Lawyers simply can't avoid communicating with clients, can they, Greg? I have found evidence that Lincoln had relationships with blacks in Springfield other than clients, relationships not mentioned by Bennett. The reason they're not mentioned in Bennett's book is that he pays little attention to the Underground Railroad. If he had, he might have seen that Underground Railroad conductors in Springfield, who were themselves black, knew and respected Lincoln. Jameson Jenkins was an African American who lived in Springfield just 1 block from Lincoln's house. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad and a drayman by occupation. As a drayman, he drove President-elect Lincoln on his last ride in Springfield from the Chenery House Hotel to the Great Western Railroad station to get on the train for Washington. Another African American who knew Lincoln was William K. Donegan. Born in Kentucky, he came to Springfield in 1845. As a shoemaker, he made shoes for Lincoln in his shop, which was just 1 block from the Lincoln-Herndon law offices. His house was only 5 blocks north of Lincoln's house, and at least one commentator calls him Lincoln's friend. Donegan was a notable conductor on the Underground Railroad and has left us with a harrowing account of the rescue of a 16-year-old black girl. A third African American who knew Lincoln was Reverend Henry Brown, a licensed preacher of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He spent a year as an itinerant minister who was often refused meals and lodging on account of his race. He stood 6'3". He weighed 250 pounds. In 1847, he got married and settled in Springfield. He was a conductor there on the Underground Railroad. And he did various jobs for Abraham Lincoln and greatly admired him. He was remembered by the family in 1865 when he was asked to come up from Quincy, where he then lived, and lead Lincoln's old family horse, Bob, in the funeral procession at Springfield. Now, here are 3 Underground Railroad conductors in Springfield who saw Lincoln regularly and perhaps were as good friends of that white man as the racially charged atmosphere of Springfield would allow. And what do I mean by the term racially charged atmosphere? I mean that Springfield was populated by Southerners who were used to slavery and who tolerated no favoritism toward freed slaves. In fact, Illinois enacted so-called black laws which kept blacks from enjoying most of the benefits of their freedom. According to Stephen Oates, to settle in Illinois, blacks needed a legally stamped certificate of freedom. Without the certificate, they could be sent back to slavery. Although seldom enforced, the certificate requirement was a terrible threat. Under the black laws, blacks could not vote, hold political office, sit on juries, give testimony against whites, or attend schools, although they paid taxes like everyone else. Why did Lincoln not campaign against the black laws? And for that matter, why wasn't he active on the Underground Railroad? The answer is first that it was futile to try to repeal black laws. They were overwhelmingly popular because of the Southern influence in Illinois. And second, Lincoln bided his time until he could be, himself, politically influential. The tide in favor of real black freedom and a constitutional amendment did not turn until the war was finally recognized for what it had become: a war against slavery, not just a war for the Union. Opposing black laws openly and participating in the Underground Railroad were things only abolitionists did, and their political influence was small. Lincoln did not want to be identified with abolitionists because his political career would be over if he did. Abolitionists did not care if a war was necessary to achieve freedom. In contrast, Lincoln hoped for avoidance of war. Better contain slavery in the South where it was going to die out. That, at least, was Lincoln's sincere hope in 1837, the year he arrived in Springfield at age 28 and made his first public statement about slavery, 24 years before the Civil War. He voted in the Illinois legislature against pro-slavery resolutions and was almost alone. Only 4 others voted with him against the resolution. To make sure everyone knew where he stood, Lincoln and a friend wrote an official protest against slavery and recorded it in the Illinois House Journal. The protest said that slavery was unjust, but that abolitionists made matters worse. It added that Congress had no constitutional authority to interfere with slavery in the South. That, in a nutshell, is where Lincoln stood until it became possible to amend the Constitution about 30 years later. But even that somewhat mild position against slavery, taken 24 years before the Civil War, put Lincoln ahead of all but a few in his hometown. Lincoln must have known of the Underground Railroad stations that operated or were operated by his African American acquaintances, Jameson Jenkins, William Donegan, Henry Brown. There's evidence that he was recognized as an anti-slavery lawyer. The founder of the Underground Railroad in Springfield was Luther N. Ransom, a white man who opened a boarding house near the Globe Tavern at a time in 1842 when newlyweds Abraham and Mary Lincoln lived there. Ransom's boarding house soon became an Underground Railroad station. One day in 1843, an Underground Railroad conductor named Samuel Willard came to Rankin from nearby Jacksonville for advice. Willard was going to be tried for the crime of assisting the escape of a fugitive slave. Willard wanted a good lawyer, and Ransom mentioned Lincoln. But then on reflection dismissed the idea because Lincoln didn't yet have any reputation as a lawyer. But Rankin added tellingly that Lincoln was not afraid of a Negro case, meaning that in the racially dangerous atmosphere of Springfield, Lincoln was not intimidated. Perhaps Lincoln should have been intimidated, however. Defending an Underground Railroad conductor could have gotten him branded as an abolitionist. Recall that in 1837, Elijah Lovejoy had been murdered by a mob in Alton for publishing an abolitionist newspaper. And working on the Underground Railroad was itself very dangerous. Springfield was a free city, but for practical purposes, it was not a safe harbor for any runaway slave, especially in the light of the black laws. That's why runaways moved right on to Canada. William Donegan, one of those African American Underground Railroad conductors Lincoln knew, tells a frightening story about saving a runaway 16-year-old girl. She was sneaked into Springfield on the Underground Railroad. Someone unloaded her quickly from a wagon, and the wagon took off because she was hotly pursued from Jacksonville, and the pursuers were not far away. She was a dangerous runaway because she had an excellent memory and could recite the names of conductors on the Underground Railroad. In other words, she must not be captured. Donegan threatened to shoot her if she didn't do exactly what he told her. Soon, her slave master and his son came knocking at the door. Donegan sent the girl out the back door to a friend's house, but the slave master somehow knew to go looking for her at the friend's house. So Donegan hurried the back way to the friend's kitchen and fetched her back just before the slave master arrived. Donegan knew his house would be watched day and night. He waited until dark. A full description of the girl had been printed in the newspaper, and so he put on a pair of white gloves. He put on a pair of white gloves on her and a white false face on her. And he hoped no one would notice her in the dark. He also told her to alter her voice. They left his house early in the night and passed 3 men who thought she looked suspicious. There was a $500 reward for her capture, and many were looking for her. After a while, the 3 men began following Donegan and the girl. A bulldog broke his chain and attacked them, catching hold of the girl's skirts. She screamed. Donegan told her to be still, placed his revolver to the dog's head and fired, splattering its brains over his hands. And then he turned to the men who were following them and shouted, "I'll kill any 4-legged or 2-legged dogs that bother her." They fell back, but did not give up. There followed some more maneuvers to avoid the pursuers. At one point, Donegan made the girl climb up into a redbud tree to wait while he looked around for enemies. Eventually, she got away. This all happened in the year 1858, the year Lincoln debated Douglas. William Donegan lived 50 more years and died tragically. On August 16, 1908, he was lynched by a mob during the Springfield race riots. The riots and the lynching led to the establishment of the NAACP. 50 years after Lincoln left Springfield, the town was still full of racial prejudice. Of what relevance is this to the Lincoln story? I discussed the racial atmosphere in which Lincoln lived to establish that it was no small matter for Lincoln to take a position against slavery. Let's reconsider the Greeley letter, where Lincoln said he would preserve the Union above all. Did the preservation of the Union really have nothing to do with slavery? Or could it be that Lincoln did connect preservation of the Union with the extinction of slavery? Lincoln consistently said that the way to get rid of slavery was to shut off the South from expansion. If the South could not export slavery to new territories, eventually slaves would be emancipated because they would no longer be valuable to their masters. The cotton economy of the South was already on the decline, for the cotton economy could not survive unless it spread into new territories with fresh soil, soil not exhausted from overcultivation. Lincoln knew this. The South knew this. Lincoln's policy of containment meant slavery's doom. That's why the South ignored Lincoln when, as president-elect, he promised in the first inaugural not to interfere with slavery where it existed. They knew his agenda was the ultimate extinction of slavery. They knew the only possibility for preservation of slavery was secession and, if necessary, war. Preservation of the Union was the surest way to eradicate slavery. But at the time that Lincoln wrote this letter to Greeley, saying that he would save the Union if it meant not freeing one slave, he was throwing red meat to the Northerners that he needed to enlist in the Army. Lincoln's pro-Union statement met with almost universal approval. Men would enlist for the Union, not for the elimination of slavery. Few people noticed the taglines in the letter to Greeley. Lincoln reaffirmed his oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free, and he said he would adopt new views so fast as they shall appear to be true views. And he already had adopted new views. As I mentioned earlier, exactly 1 month before the Greeley letter, he read the first draft of his Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. He hoped the Greeley letter would soften the disappointment most Northerners would have when they learned about the proclamation. Lincoln was adamant that all men were created equal economically, even if not necessarily socially. He had always opposed slavery on moral grounds. As a boy, he was the sexton of his parents' Primitive Baptist Church in southern Indiana. It was an anti-slavery church, and there's every reason to think he absorbed his parents' opposition to slavery as a child. He once said, "I'm naturally anti-slavery. If slavery's not wrong, nothing's wrong." Yet at first, biblical principles were not the source of Lincoln's anti-slavery sentiments. During the years just before the war, the Declaration of Independence provided Lincoln's so-called political religion. Because all men are created equal, it is wrong for one man to rule another without his consent. In that time and place, Lincoln allowed himself to advocate economic freedom, but steer clear of unpopular pronouncements about the races being equal. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, his political religion for African Americans was perfectly expressed in the following celebrated quote: "In the right to eat the bread which his own hand earns, the Negro is my equal, and the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every other man." In September 1862, when he told his cabinet that he decided to issue the proclamation, he said, "There's no turning back." Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy who was there, wrote in his diary that Lincoln said shortly after the meeting that the recent victory at Antietam was an indication of divine will, and that it was his duty to move forward in the cause of emancipation. God had decided this question in favor of the slaves. The second inaugural further evidences that Lincoln saw the will of God in the Civil War. We see in the inaugural a reflection of the economic equality he espoused in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln said, "It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. And then he echoed the statement about God's will as recorded by Gideon Welles after Antietam. He said in the second inaugural, "The mighty has his own purposes. He gives to both North and South this terrible war. Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited soil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must still be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." It's undeniable that Lincoln found slavery detestable. It's also undeniable that he pandered to his political audiences by making statements that we find racist today. Sometimes I want to say, will the real Lincoln please stand up? One writer says, slavery, not race, was the issue in the 1850s. Republicans, as a major party, had to dissociate themselves from racial equalizing in order to gain power to restrain slavery. That, in a nutshell, explains why Lincoln was cautious not to join the abolitionists. I hope to have shown that Lincoln was no enemy of the black race, as I'm afraid Mr. Bennett believes. My own views are more nearly reflected by an African-American Harvard professor, Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who just this month published a book entitled Lincoln in Black and White. Gates said in an interview about his book just a week ago, and I quote, "Here's the complicated truth. Lincoln was always opposed to slavery as an institution, but he was deeply ambivalent about the status of black people. The difference between Lincoln and everybody else is that he had a capacity to grow. In the last speech of his life, Lincoln said for the first time in the American presidency, 'I want to give the right to vote to black men.' He thought the Declaration of Independence included black men. Thomas Jefferson didn't do that." Thank you very much for having me.